Welcome back to the second part of a discussion I'm having with Professor Alan Ford on the topic of why do Protestants hate Catholics? And in the previous film that we made, Alan was looking at the origins of a mindset of viewing religion in black and white terms, a way that would be very alien to the way most Christians would view their religion today, and how that affected the understanding of religion in the late 16th century. Now, Alan, will you talk about the legacy of that mindset?
It's extraordinarily powerful in Irish history. The one distinguishing feature of the history of Ireland that most outside people would know would be the fact that Irish Protestants and Irish Catholics don't get on and haven't got on for a long time. And the legacy of that religious division, that quite stark theological and political division which began in the 16th century, echoed down the centuries in Irish history. What we have, in essence, throughout the 18th and 19th and even the early 20th century in Ireland is two religious traditions, a Protestant and a Catholic one, each with two completely different mindsets, theologically, politically and culturally. On the Protestant side, the Protestant mindset saw Catholicism as basically a flawed religion, superstitious, semi-pagan, corrupt, enthralled to the papacy in Rome. Against that, it offered a Protestant biblicism that was based upon a simple and straightforward reading of the Bible, and this biblical truth was seen as carrying all before it against the superstition of Catholicism. This sense that the Protestants had the truth was a very powerful sustaining force for Irish Protestants down the centuries. And of course they had, for the 18th and 19th centuries, the great asset of they controlled the Irish state, they owned most of the land, and they dictated public policy in Ireland. The result was a perpetuation right down until the 20th century of this fundamental division between Catholic and Protestant in Ireland, this fundamental suspicion and hatred between Protestant and Catholic in Ireland.
We've talked about that as a historical legacy, but there's a problem for the historian confronting that, because that sort of black and white religion, this is not something we associate with Christianity today. That's something that I think both of us would be incredibly thankful for. And it means that when we hear someone who uses the language of the Antichrist, and for instance the late Ian Paisley, he used the language of the Antichrist, this seems a completely alien thing, only done by the nutters on the fringe. How do we explain that that wasn't the nutters on the fringe?
Absolutely. I accept your point that we have a great tendency to underplay the depth of religious hatred in Ireland up till relatively recently.
Or pretend that the religion, it's not really about religion, it's really about politics.
It's really about politics. There are some political theorists who argue it's not a religious problem at all. I find that quite baffling. The real challenge that this legacy has left for Irish churchmen, Irish writers and thinkers, is how do we confront this fundamental Reformation divide? The Reformation set up the differences between Protestant and Catholic as a zero-sum game, we're right, you're wrong. How do you deal with that in a modern ecumenical age? And if you like, the history of the churches in Ireland in the 20th century is about rising to that challenge, often failing to meet it, but trying to confront this problem of we have a real challenge in Ireland where people are killing each other because of religion. We as churches preach a gospel of love and fellowship, yet people are being killed in the name of our churches. And one of the things I've been working on a lot recently is looking at the ways in which the Protestant church in Ireland, in particular the Church of Ireland, has tried to confront its Reformation legacy, it still adheres to the 39 Articles, the official confession of faith of the Church of Ireland and the Church of England, which contains some quite inflammatory statements about the blasphemy of the Mass, for instance. How does a church that wishes to live in fellowship with its fellow churches in Ireland today, how does it deal with this tradition, this historical legacy, this fact that it has this confession of faith which contains these statements?
And there's another problem that faces religions, and Catholics and Protestants in Ireland is a good example of it. When you actually start trying to overcome your historical legacy, you want to overcome it, and you'd love the other person to overcome their historical legacy, but you don't want to sell the pass.
No.
And there's this fear, like,
yes.
like for instance, the Church of England now asks its ordinands to sign the ancient. They don't actually mention the 39 Articles. It's a generic phrase, the ancient formularies.
Yes. The Church of Ireland has a similar ambiguous relationship to the 39 Articles. There was a former Protestant Archbishop of Dublin who said that when he swore assent to the 39 Articles when he was ordained, he had his fingers crossed behind his back. In other words, he didn't really believe in them. And if you talk to a lot...
Who was that?
Neil. If you talk to a lot of Southern Irish Protestants, they will say the 39 Articles are irrelevant. And the Church of Ireland Synod did actually, in the late 20th century, the very last year of it, did make a statement saying that the form of words used in the 39 Articles are not such that we'd wish to associate ourselves with. But what they had here was a fundamental problem. They still believe in the doctrine of the 39 Articles, but they're not very happy with the way it's expressed, which is a very difficult thing to do, to get over. And of course there's a fundamental problem here, which of course, even though the Southern Church of Ireland is quite happy to forget about the 39 Articles, in the north of Ireland we have another half, or 3/4 in terms of membership, of the Church of Ireland, which are much less happy to abandon the 39 Articles. And when you look at the correspondence pages of that most wonderful of journals, the Church of Ireland Gazette, in the late 20th and early 21st century, you will see a series of letters from members of the Church of Ireland, ordained and lay in the north, coruscating their southern brethren for abandoning the principles of the Reformation contained in the 39 Articles.
So this touches the larger problem. Religions by their nature are inheritances. Yes. Religions by their nature are traditions, even though they mightn't like the concept of traditions. And traditions operate such that it makes it harder for you to cop on in the present because you don't want to sell the legacy.
What the Southern Church is basically doing is they're offering amnesia as a solution. And it is a very nice solution. Let's forget about these awful things that have happened in the past, these things we've committed ourselves to in the past, and let's start again with nice, loving fellowship Christianity. There's another way forward, however, which is a much more interesting way, and one I've been exploring recently, which is ARCIC. ARCIC is the Anglican Roman Catholic International Commission, which was set up in the 1970s. In those halcyon days of ecumenism, which was led initially by a Church of Ireland bishop and then Archbishop of Dublin, Henry McAdoo. And what ARCIC tried to do, and succeeded to a certain extent, was to get behind and beyond the Reformation and Counter-Reformation anathemas, the hatred, the zero-sum game, and construct a shared religious, theological statement of what they agreed on. Let's go back to the early church councils, back to the Bible, construct things we agree on, and then move forward with that, moving around and beyond the Reformation divisions. That's had a very mixed response in Ireland.
And partly because, from the Catholic perspective, of course, there was the great awareness after the Second Vatican Council. We realise the old way was daft, and we want to do something new and nice, and almost let's start with a clean slate. And yet, how could you start at a clean slate and not deny the past? Because if you were to deny the past, you would suddenly find yourself cut off.
Yeah, the classic issue here is transubstantiation. Transubstantiation is, I'm afraid I'm speaking as a Protestant here, an 11th century invention. Aristotelian
and of course
science.
the other thing is there's not one doctrine of transubstantiation, there's 1,500 different doctrines. Even in Trent there's two conflicting doctrines operating.
And it's very hard for the Catholic Church to abandon transubstantiation. Archic offered a way forward, which I think the Catholic Church has rejected. And we still have a fundamental problem, fundamental ecumenical problem about the fact that we don't share communion. There was a statement by the Catholic hierarchies of Britain and Ireland, one bread, one body, which basically said you cannot share communion with Protestants, because we do not accept that the communion offered in a Protestant church is a valid one. And that is one of the most fundamental challenges we face in ecumenism in Ireland, of trying to get back behind the Reformation to that wonderful period when we could actually share communion.
Alan, the most interesting thing about these videos is we do them to try and make clear problems we know about, but the most interesting is that they raise just how many problems we still have to deal with. Thank you very much.